President, please be seated. We are now back in session, and once again we would like to hand the floor to Nuon Chia's defense to continue their presentation on the closing statement. You may proceed. Sonarun, my respects to the venerable monks who are participating in today's proceeding. And once again, good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honors. And good afternoon, everyone. I would like now to resume my presentation. I would like now to turn to certain gross misrepresentations of the co-prosecutors. Throughout this trial, they have suggested that Nuon Chia was a monster and that his intent was to create a slave state in Cambodia. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nuon Chia loves his country and his people, and he dedicated himself to its development. To Nuon Chia, such accusations are appalling and unbelievable, and they reflect a complete misunderstanding of who he is. As Nuon Chia has said in his own words, quote, "I have devoted myself to serving the country. I have put my family behind for the love of my country," end of quote. One needs only look at his life to understand its truth. Nuon Chia never wavered from his objectives. He never became rich. He never acted opportunistically to seek position or privilege for himself or his family. He lived meagerly in the Cambodian jungle for nearly 30 years in the service of the principles in which he believed. He worked clandestinely and in constant danger in Phnom Penh for 20 years more. The misunderstanding of Nuon Chia's intent and role within the CPK can be seen in other ways. For example, Nuon Chia was never known during Democratic Cambodia or prior to 1975 as Brother Number 2. To Nuon Chia, the origin of this is a mystery. Nuon Chia notes that several witnesses to appear before this tribunal claim to recall the use of this title to describe him. Like the experts who do not even know Nuon Chia's name, these witnesses are also mistaken. Their testimony demonstrates the fallibility of human memory, and in particular the tendency to create false memories consistent with widely held misconceptions. Nuon Chia has also observed that he is regularly described in the popular media as the chief ideologue of the CPK. For a man who did not write a single word of CPK philosophy, that title makes no sense. Nuon Chi's principal role in the CPK was in political education. He disseminated political and strategic lines to cadres throughout the party. He also participated over time in the development of CPK policy as a senior leader of the party. But Nuon Chi was not an intellectual, and as he told this chamber, he was instructed by Pol Pot not to concern himself with the intellectuals in the party. It was never his role to set the direction of party policy. Conventional wisdom also misstates the principal influences on Nuon Chi's early revolutionary life. Although Nuon Chi was influenced by some of Mao Zedong's writings, his philosophy was not ultra-Maoist. Instead, distracted the Gang of Four, that is China's indigenous ultra-Maoist, whom he suspected of being interested only in power. Nuon Chi's formative communist training was in North Vietnam, and accordingly, he identifies as a conventional Marxist-Leninist. He points to Trung Chinh, the first General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam, and second to Ho Chi Minh in the Vietnamese communist hierarchy from 1941 until 1957 as his primary influence. Related is the misconception that Pol Pot and Nuon Chi were adherents to a sui generis philosophy that marked a fundamental divide between them and the Vietnamese influenced communists in the East Zone. As Nuon Chi told Tet Sambat, his closest friend and confidant within the CPK was Sao Pham. The origin of that friendship was in their shared training in Vietnam in 1954. Tet Sambat summarizes the nature and history of their relationship accurately as follows, and I quote, Nuon Chi had built up the Eastern Zone with Sao Pham, who was placed in charge of the zone after the Khmer Rouge's victory in 1975. The two had known each other even longer than Nuon Chi had known Pol Pot. Because of their long history together, the two were very close. When Sao Pham came to Phnom Penh, he stayed at Nuon Chi's home during the Khmer Rouge years in power. Sao Pham was like a brother to Nuon Chi. We took care of each other, Nuon Chi said. I loved him and he loved me. I was the closest to him because we used to struggle together and we took care of each other. He used to protect me. End of quote. Nuon Chi had great faith in Sao Pham's abilities as a leader within the Cambodian communist movement. Nuon Chi is accordingly not surprised by the findings of some academics, notably Professor Kiernan, that East Zone policy was more flexible as the conduct of East Zone cadres more disciplined than elsewhere in the country. Sarpam was a trained communist who understood and sought to further core CPK objectives, improving rice yields and the living standards of average Cambodians. As Steve Heder rightly testified, the policies of the East Zone were more in line with the intent of the party center than the hardline attitudes found in other parts of the country, especially the Northwest Zone. It must also be noted that the belief that Nuon Chea was aligned with some zone leaders against the others is simply incorrect. To the contrary, Nuon Chea gained a reputation within the Standing Committee as a negotiator and a peacemaker, someone who could bring warring factions together. Sarpam's ultimate rift with Pol Pot was accordingly not rooted in any deep-seated ideological differences. It was instead the byproduct of the CPK's complicated and shifting relationship with Vietnam. When Sarpam was accused in 1978 of betraying the CPK by selling rice to the Vietnamese, Nuon Chea was deeply conflicted. Along with Pol Pot, he tried to persuade Sarpam not to support the Vietnamese against the CPK. Nuon Chea disagreed with Pol Pot's decision to send troops to the East Zone, but he had no authority to stop it. Regarding Nuon Chea's relationship with Vietnam, observers such as Philip Short are simply misinformed when they conclude that a fundamental ideological or historical divide separated the leaders of the CPK from their counterparts in Vietnam. Although some of the CPK's policies varied from those implemented by the Vietnamese, that difference was the product of context. As a smaller, more vulnerable country, Cambodia was forced to row quickly in order to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Nuon Chea both valued and appreciated his experience learning from the Vietnamese communists. He was never resentful toward the Vietnamese for giving him menial tasks during his time studying in Vietnam, as some authors suggest about Pol Pot. Instead, he welcomed Vietnamese participation and saw the Vietnamese as his allies and comrades in arms. The Vietnamese were fighting the same battle against the same enemies and doing so successfully. Nuon Chea admired their courage and their abilities. Nuon Chea also had good reason to be wary of Vietnam's intentions and their claim of right on Cambodian territory. The Vietnamese communists spoke openly of an Indo-Chinese Federation and of Vietnam's special relationship with Cambodia. Prince Sihanouk was equally alarmed by Vietnamese designs on Cambodian territory, arguing that once the war ended, a reunified Vietnam would once again turn its energies to subjugating its smaller neighbors. Even after 17 April 1975, the Vietnamese continued to assert that they had a claim on the Cambodian Communist movement and over Cambodian territory. Vietnam's interference in the progress of Cambodian socialism went beyond vague statements of principle. Prior to 1970, the North Vietnamese openly resisted the efforts of the Cambodian communists to secure the same liberation from the Americans as they were seeking in a unified Vietnamese state. When leaders of the CPK told the North Vietnamese that the CPK intended to follow its own path, Vietnamese leaders were taken aback by the show of independence and became incensed. Following the 1970 coup, they operated entire units on Cambodian soil, subjected military and civilian personnel to their authority, and sent weapons and equipment captured from Khmer Republic forces back to Vietnam. After the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which mandated the departure of Vietnamese troops from Cambodian territory, they remained in Cambodia without CPK permission. However, Nuon Chia's reaction to these tensions was neither extreme nor spiteful. During the entire period of the Civil War, Nuon Chia acted as the CPK's emissary to Hanoi, finding political negotiated settlements to the disputes over territory and military command. In that sense, he filled the same role in relation to the CPK's relationship with Vietnam as he did within the CPK, resolving tensions between friendly but competing factions. Yet, between 1975 and 1979, the Vietnamese threat became considerably worse. As this chamber has already held, Vietnam and Cambodia were at war from the moment the CPK liberated Phnom Penh. East Zone cadres became formulating plans to revolt weeks after 17 April 1975. Luk Sao, a messenger in the East Zone Army, testified that Chan Chakray, the commander of the East Zone 4th Division, was plotting to seize power back from Pol Pot on 17 April 1976 at a conference in Phnom Penh in May 1975. Nuon Chia has reason to believe that Ruh Nhiem and Sao Pham, Chakray's direct superior, discussed an alliance against the party center at this same meeting. Chakray's deputy was Heng Som Ren, who admits to plotting against Pol Pot in 1978. Som Ren, of course, followed through. The CPK's fears about Vietnamese intentions were neither unfounded nor exaggerated. Definitive proof of this is found in the simple fact that they all came to pass. Nuon Chia takes bitter satisfaction from the minutes of the 26 March 1976 meeting of the Standing Committee, which record his warning to be vigilant for another thing with people who flee to Vietnam and who do not return and make propaganda leading others to revolt. Despite Vietnam's efforts to justify its invasion and 10-year occupation of Cambodia by accusing the CPKs of atrocities, There is little doubt that its real motivation was a question of domination, control, and territory, of ridding Vietnam of the problem of Cambodia once and forever. The communists in Hanoi had turned a near disaster into a historic opportunity to realize what their predecessors had attempted centuries earlier, that is, control over the Mekong River. Nuon Chea believes that there is a strong likelihood that the evidence understates the extent to which the Vietnamese sought to interfere in the internal affairs of democratic Cambodia. The Vietnamese had 10 years of unfettered access to the Cambodian government archives before any serious effort to collect and organize those archives began. David Chandler noted in testimony before the chamber that certain key documents have never been found, including the confession of Northeast Zone Secretary Nay Saran alias Ja. Professor Chandler hypothesized that PRK authorities may have sought to filter out those documents that tended to show that Vietnam was subverting the DK regime. Ong Thong Huong, who worked for the PRK at the nascent Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in the summer of 1979, confirmed that some documents were indeed missing. The Vietnamese government conspicuously failed to respond to a request by the co-investigating judges, prompted by a request from the Nuon Chea's defense, to turn over relevant documents in its possession to this tribunal. I would like now move on to the role of Nuon Chea. Mr. President, I will now turn to a discussion of Nuon Chea's role in the SCPK. As your honors have likely already observed, the co-prosecutors have dedicated a significant amount of time and energy to the discussion of Nuon Chea's alleged role in the CPK. Much of this discussion concerns the seniority of Nuon Chea's position. They emphasized that Nuon Chea was Deputy Secretary of the party and that he participated in formulating the political and strategic lines of the CPK. Yet, Nuon Chea has already himself confirmed many times in the past that these allegations are accurate. So, why have the co-prosecutors spent so much time trying to prove an allegation that Nuon Chea has already told the chamber is true? Perhaps it is because, in regards to Nuon Chea's role, the co-prosecutors know there is nothing else they can actually prove. The other allegations about Nuon Chea's role are in error. The co-prosecutors hope to convince you that just because Nuon Chea held a position of significant authority within the CPK, that he personally performed functions in every aspect of the democratic Cambodia government. They seem to think that Nuon Chia's position alone is enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Nuon Chia somehow exercised control over cadres at every level in the CPK hierarchy. The co-prosecutors are again confusing formal structure with practical realities. The truth is that many of the areas the co-prosecutors claim Nuon Chia had responsibility for were in fact outside the scope of his duties as Deputy Secretary. Similarly, Nuon Chia had only a limited ability to exercise control over cadres at lower levels of the CPK hierarchy. In order to show this more clearly, I will now review several erroneous claims advanced by the co-prosecutors in relation to Nuon Chia's role in the CPK. On the appointments, for example, the co-prosecutors claimed that Nuon Chia was, and I quote, the primary person in charge of the assignment, promotion, discipline, re-education, punishment, and removal of parties cadre. End of quote. That claim is at paragraph 437 of the co-prosecutor's brief. But the evidence relied on by the co-prosecutors fails to support this claim in the slightest. Instead, most of the evidence cited by the co-prosecutors is extra testimony given by witnesses who could provide no actual specific evidence of Nuon Chia's role. Instead, these witnesses admitted repeatedly through the chamber that they knew nothing during Democratic Cambodia about the roles of the senior leaders. Those witnesses include Duch, Nong Supong, and Salot Ban. The limits of Dutch knowledge are described in detail in our brief at paragraph 120. In that paragraph, we listed Dutch's numerous admissions that he knew nothing of the Standing Committee or the substance of Nuon Chia's role during Democratic Cambodia, and his concessions that in the years since he has closely followed these proceedings and studied a broad array of secondary source material about Democratic Cambodia. It is clear that his testimony reflects no actual knowledge and is therefore plainly irrelevant. Nong So Paul gave similar testimony. He indicated that he knew nothing about the role of the Standing Committee or of its respective members. The relevant references in that regard are in our brief at footnote 49. The third witness, Salot Ban, testified similarly.
The co-prosecutor then cited to an interview given by Ieng Sari. Tellingly, in that interview, Ieng Sary makes a very narrow claim about Nuon Chia's role in appointments. Ieng Sary states that Nuon Chia and Pol Pot decided on the appointment of diplomats and other senior cadres in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nuon Chia denies that and notes that in the interview cited by the co-prosecutors, Ieng Sary claims that Nuon Chia was responsible for these appointments as part of his effort to diminish his own responsibility. He made that claim in response to a question from Stephen Hatter about his own role in making those appointments. Nevertheless, even if Ieng Sary's claim were reliable, which it is not, it concerns only appointments within the ministries. It says nothing about appointments in the national administrative structure, which were under the control of and required the cooperation of zone secretaries. Finally, the co-prosecutors point to two interviews with Nuon Chia himself. And in addition, the prosecutor failed to mention that Nuon Chia had the authority to remove anyone in the structure of the Democratic Cambodia. And if there was such a case, there would have remained some evidentiary documents left until today. Finally, the co-prosecutor pointed to two interviews with Nuon Chia. One of those interviews, I would like to refer to document number E3/26. Mr. Nuon Chia says nothing about his own role in the appointments. Instead, he merely indicates that criminal activity was punished. In the second interview, document number E3/108, Nuon Chia's statement is consistent with all his other testimony. It indicates that he took action against cadres who deviated from the party line to the extent of his ability to do so. Yet, as the statement goes on to say, his ability to do so was practically limited. He explicitly says that he was, I quote, unable to control lower-level cadres, unquote. That was especially true within the national administrative structure. As he has consistently stated to interviewees and before this chamber, the party center failed to adequately control the conduct of those lower-level cadres. That failing is one reason, among others, why Nuon Chia believes that he bears moral responsibility for events in Democratic Cambodia. Next, the co-prosecutors claim that Nuon Chia had, I quote, oversight responsibility, unquote, for the ministries of propaganda, education, and social affairs. With regard to propaganda and education, that claim is partially true. But with regard to social affairs, it is not true at all. As the Chamber is aware, Nuon Chia has consistently indicated that His primary responsibilities in the CPK concern propaganda and education. And Nuon Chea agrees that he made decisions about the content of the political education materials produced by the CPK within the Ministry of Propaganda and Education. He similarly does not disagree that he was sometimes present at the ministry and interacted with cadres who worked there. Nuon Chea clarifies only that he was at no time the Minister of Propaganda. That role was occupied by Yon Yat throughout democratic Cambodia. With regard to the social affairs, the co-prosecutor relies solely on the testimony of three wholly unreliable witnesses in that attempt to support their claim that Nuon Chea oversaw that ministry. Unsurprisingly, none of this testimony comes close to establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that Nuon Chea had any role in any capacity in this regard. The first witness relied upon by the co-prosecutor is Dutch, who has no relevant knowledge of the reason I have already just discussed. The second is Ieng Thieret, who testified before the pre-trial chamber in February 2009 that Nuon Chea ordered the arrest of students working at the Ministry of Social Affairs. That testimony was given long after Ieng Thieret's mental faculties were compromised and not long before this chamber determined that she was unfit to stand trial. To give the chamber some extent of her testimony, shortly after vaguely blaming Nuon Chea for ordering the execution of her students, she added, and I quote, "Don't implicate me with Nuon Chea because they did a lot to my student and it is very unjust. So don't accuse me of murder, otherwise you will be cursed to the seven level of hells," unquote. Other testimony she gave that day is quite similar to and reflects the nature and reliability of her memory at that time. And the third witness, Kampon, testified that he took Ieng Thieret to meetings at K3 2 or 3 times each month. Although he claims that Ieng Thieret met Nuon Chea in those meetings, he testified that he waited outside the car and never entered the building. He specifically stated that Ieng Thieret did not tell him who she met at K3. So his testimony that she met Nuon Chea is therefore based entirely on speculation. It should be disregarded by this chamber for that reason. It is absolutely crucial to note that aside from these 3 unreliable witnesses, the co-prosecutors cannot point to any other shred of evidence of Nuon Chea's involvement. They cite no telegram showing Nuon Chea had any role in social affairs. They rely on no standing committee meetings showing Nuon Chea's commentary on issues concerning social affairs. They do not even attempt to explain to this chamber what it is that they think Nuon Chea did in relation to the Ministry of Social Affairs. In the People's Representative Assembly, the co-prosecutor made a variety of submissions about Nuon Chea's role as chairman of the People's Representative Assembly, and I will make just one comment about these submissions. That comment concerns the 8th of March 1976 minutes of the meetings of the Standing Committee. The co-prosecutor have relied on the English language version of this document extensively. They relied it in document presentation hearings and again in this closing statement. Based on the English version of the minutes of that meeting, the co-prosecutors claimed that the Standing Committee described the People's Representative Assembly as, I quote, worthless, end quote. The English translation is, however, not correct. Actually, the correct translation in Khmer, based on that minutes of the meeting, means differently. And I would like to now quote that excerpts. Education and propaganda, quote, if anyone asks, this excerpt relates to education and propaganda. Quote, if anyone asks, we must explain not to be vile and disorderly. Do not let it be seen that we wanted to suppress. At the same time, do not speak playfully about the assembly in front of the people to let them see that we are deceptive and our assembly is worthless. So please refer to this portion in document E3/232, and in English is 001826330. In this respect, that meeting did not say that the People's Representative Assembly was worthless. The co-prosecutor then claimed that Nuon Chea was once the acting Prime Minister of Democratic Cambodia for 1 year in 1976 to 1977. The chamber is familiar with Nuon Chea's position about this. He has consistently denied it. And he is not familiar with any of the documents that purport to describe him as the acting Prime Minister. He does not know whether they are authentic or why they describe him as the acting Prime Minister. But most importantly, this issue is of no significance to this case. And the co-prosecutors state at paragraph 449 of their brief that Nuon Chea's supposed role as acting Prime Minister, I quote, confirms his role and authenticity as the second highest ranking member of the CPK, unquote. Nuon Chea has never disputed this. It follows that if Nuon Chea truly was the acting Prime Minister, he would have readily acknowledged that role, as he did in regards to his position as Deputy Secretary. With nothing to lose from such an admission, the fact that Nuon Chea has consistently denied that he was acting Prime Minister confirms that he never was. Now, Your Honours, the co-prosecutor have then claimed that the two documents, they refer to the documents from the broadcasting service, the Phnom Penh Home Service, on the 17th of January 1977, when Nuon Chea delivers a speech on the Army anniversary. It was in the 17th of January 1977, and he was alleged to be the acting Prime Minister over there. However, these two documents, if we compare these two broadcasts, they were contradictory, and I would like to now refer to the excerpt from this Phnom Penh Broadcasting Service. I quote, the first document E3/193, here and in Khmer 00669990, on page 1, paragraph 2. It reads, on this occasion and under the present circumstances, I wish to make two important points. The first is that the founding anniversary of our 9-year-old army reminds us of the very high sense of heroism of our revolutionary army. Unquote. The second document E3/147, here and in Khmer 00779793. On the second page, paragraph 2, it reads, the first point is that the anniversary of our revolutionary army reminds us of its great sense of heroism. Based on these two excerpts from the Phnom Penh Home Service, this was broadcast from the same radio station, but it contained different message. It simply means that Nuon Chea was not delivering the message or the speech at that time. If he had participated in that anniversary, the quote of his speech would not have been this different. This difference has given rise to the suspicion that this assertion is not based on any substantial evidence. Now, Your Honours, I would like to turn to the military and security issue. The co-prosecutor claimed that Nuon Chea was responsible for military and security affairs. In fact, the co-prosecutor have gone so far to argue in their brief that Nuon Chea's responsibility for military and security affairs is so clearly established by the evidence that his denial is, I quote, contrived, end quote. This is nothing but pure posturing, a blatant effort to misrepresent the evidence. In reality, there is almost no evidence that Nuon Chea had a role in military affairs, while the evidence that he had a role in security affairs is both conflicted and inconsistent. Regarding Nuon Chea's alleged role in military affairs, the co-prosecutors claimed that the expert evidence before the chamber establishes that Nuon Chea had a role in military and security affairs, and that he was a member of the party military committee. This claim is simply not true. Philip Short could not have been more blunt. He stated, quote, no, I don't think Nuon Chea had a military role, end quote. That is on page 81 of the May the 6th, 2013 transcript. Then he stated, and I quote, Nuon Chea was not part of the military committee, unquote. That is available on page 83 of the same transcript on the 6th of May. Mr. Philip Short added that, I thought it was, quote, undoubtedly true, unquote, that Nuon Chea was not a member of the military committee. Professor David Chandler testified that he could only offer, quote unquote, speculation as to whether Nuon Chea had any responsibility for military affairs. And I would like to add that if the Chamber refers to paragraph 457 of the co-prosecutor's submission, the co-prosecutors assert that Professor Chandler testified that it was, quote, had to believe, unquote, that Nuon Chea had a role in military affairs. That is not an accurate rendering of the testimony cited, and I will just encourage the Chamber to read the excerpt in which Professor Chandler says nothing of the sort. Second, the co-prosecutors claim that other members of the party knew that they were supposed to communicate with Nuon Chea about military and security matters, and that this is reflected in Nuon Chea's receipt of telegrams on those subjects. This too is simply false. In fact, over the entire length of democratic Cambodia, over nearly 4 years, the co-prosecutor were only able to find exactly 6 telegrams concerning military or security affairs that were sent specifically to Nuon Chea. The co-prosecutor have referred repeatedly to these telegrams, first in their document presentation hearings and now again in their closing submissions. The co-prosecutors repeat over and over that these telegrams are very significant because they show that other members of the party knew to communicate with Nuon Chea about military affairs. In fact, they are significant because they are very nearly the only ones that exist if Nuon Chea was, in reality, responsible for military and security affairs. All correspondence on such matters would have been channeled through him. Instead of the hundreds of telegrams in evidence that concern military and security affairs, there were almost none addressed specifically to Nuon Chea. These 6 telegrams were all from the same specific military officer, an officer named Dim in Division 164, and they were sent in very close succession in October 1976, and they all concern generally the same subject matter. At best, they show that somebody in the party believed that one specific issue needed to be brought to Nuon Chea's attention. Nuon Chea does not remember these telegrams and does not know why they were sent to him, if in fact they were sent to him. But it is obvious that they signify nothing relevant to Nuon Chea's general responsibilities. And the co-prosecutors' continued reliance on this specific group of telegrams show that no other evidence exists. Your Honors, I will make one final comment about the telegrams in evidence. I will point out that there are numerous telegrams in evidence that were sent to other party leaders, but which were not sent to Nuon Chea. I will offer just a few document numbers. These include document number E3/1016, IS 21.6, E3/1176, E3/1186, IS 21.2, E3/1075, IS 21.9, E3/1065 and E3/250. These telegrams were sent, among others, to Ieng Sari, Won Wait, and Ieng Thirit, but not Nuon Chea. So these telegrams affirmatively disprove the prosecution's claim that Nuon Chea had a role in military affairs. They show that cadres across the party knew that they were not supposed to communicate with Nuon Chea about military and security affairs. They were instead supposed to communicate with other senior leaders. Then the co-prosecutors point to a single meeting of the Standing Committee where Nuon Chea is allegedly recorded as having made some commentary about military affairs. And that is the 26th of March 1976 meeting of the committee. Yet, if the Chamber reviews this document carefully, it will clearly see that it actually shows that Nuon Chea had no substantive role in military affairs. As the co-prosecutors indicate, the only reason Nuon Chea said anything at this meeting is because Pol Pot was absent. In Pol Pot's absence, Nuon Chea's principal instruction was to, and I quote, keep implementing, unquote. The vague instruction previously articulated by Pol Pot at a meeting of the Standing Committee 2 weeks earlier. So, instead of issuing an independent instructions, Nuon Chea deferred to Pol Pot, simply reiterating Pol Pot's past instructions. And that reflects the substance of Nuon Chea's role in military affairs. No other evidence exists. Next, the co-prosecutor points out that Nuon Chea, I quote, presided over a meeting concerning the restructuring of the Revolutionary Army of Cambodia in July 1975. The Chamber is, of course, very familiar with this meeting.
As the Chamber knows, this was a seminal moment in the development of the CPK. It marks the very first time that some military units were placed under the control of the party center. Thousands of cadres were present. Nuon Chea was the number 2 member of the party. Of course he was there, and of course he was in a prominent position. The same goes for all the other members of the Standing Committee and numerous members of the Central Committee. But his presence was entirely ceremonial. It means nothing in relation to his role in the party or the military. Continuing on the subject of military meetings, much more relevant and compelling testimony is given by Valpla's witnesses who confirmed that Nuon Chea had no role of responsibility within the military. These witnesses say that Nuon Chea did not attend military meetings. They say he did not attend those meetings because he had nothing to do with the military. One of those witnesses, Eun Tan, who was Pol Pot's chief bodyguard, testified before this chamber that military gatherings in Phnom Penh were chaired by Pol Pot and Son Sen. He specifically explained that Nuon Chea did not attend those gatherings because he was, and I quote, attached to other section, end of quote. And that testimony given on the 14th of June 2012 at pages 16 and 41 of that day's transcript. Another witness was Ms. Vươn, who was possibly the senior most military officer to appear before the chamber. By the end of Democratic Cambodia, he was a deputy divisional commander and the de facto secretary of Sector 103, and he said that Nuon Chea did not attend zone-level military congresses. In fact, he said that repeatedly, and in saying it, he directly contradicted the written records of his interviews with the investigating judges, which were apparently incorrect. That testimony was given on the 4th of October 2012 between pages 46 and 54, and again on the next trial day, that is the 8th of October 2012, between pages 92 and 98. Next, the co-prosecutors referred this chamber to a document from the Vietnamese Courier from 1972, purporting to describe Nuon Chea's role as, and I quote, head of the political leadership of the army, end of quote. Like most of the evidence cited by the co-prosecutors, this document too supports Nuon Chea's position that he was a civilian leader with no role in military affairs. The document clearly indicates that Son Sen was Chief of General Staff. That Vietnamese Courier did not know well about the structure of the CPK. Nuon Chea led political education sessions for troops, just like he educated cadres in the political goals of the party. It is in that limited sense that he had a political leadership role in the military. And the document clearly indicates that Son Sen was the Chief of General Staff. And it also clearly indicates that Pol Pot was in charge of military affairs of the army. Mr. President, I think it is a time for a short break. I have about 20 more pages to go. President, you need to continue for another 5 minutes, and we will take a break at 20 to 3. Next, I'd like to touch upon S21. As part of their futile effort to prove Nuon Chea's role in security affairs, the co-prosecutors expend significant energy discussing Nuon Chea's supposed role at S21. These allegations are false and supported only by conflicting and unreliable evidence. Indeed, the only evidence that Nuon Chea had any role at S21 is from Kang Cách Yêu alias Dutch. Yet, Dutch had good and substantial reasons to mislead this chamber. No compelling corroborating evidence exists. The chamber, for that reason, rejects that testimony in full. As a preliminary matter, we reiterate our position that as a consequence of the limitations on the scope of this trial, the Chamber is incapable of making findings of fact in relation to S21. S21 was specifically excluded from this trial by this Chamber, notwithstanding repeated requests by the co-prosecutors to include it. We recognize that 3 thought paragraphs of the closing order, including within the scope of this trial, make a small number of very general allegations about Nuon Chia's role at S21. But numerous other facts of key relevance to Nuon Chia's alleged role were explicitly excluded. These include 26 paragraphs of the closing order, that is from paragraphs 949 through 974, which concern Nuon Chia's supposed role at S21. All of this was excluded from the scope of this trial. As we will see momentarily, numerous facts of critical relevance to the question of Nuon Chia's involvement are among these facts which were excluded. The limited and partial evidence as to S21, which was included within the scope of the present trial, manifestly fails to establish that Nuon Chia had any role at S21. The co-prosecutors first tried to convince this Chamber that Nuon Chia's role at S21 is proven by the fact that he received S21 confessions from Dodge. Yet, according to the co-prosecutor's own evidence, Nuon Chia supposedly saw a total of 25 confessions. Our question is this: what is 25 confessions? Is 25 a lot? 25 of how many? And how many confessions are on the case file? How many confessions were found at S21? And how many are stored at DCCAM? Your Honours, according to records stored on the case file, the total number of confessions available is 4,189. Now we know that when the investigation into the events during Democratic Cambodia began, the S21 confessions were one of the most important sources of historical evidence. From the very beginning of the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, the People's Republic of Cambodia had a keen interest in S21. This chamber has heard testimony that staff members were working at S21, reviewing documents as early as the summer of 1979. Leading scholars who would later play a crucial role in developing the factual allegations at this tribunal spent years reviewing and analyzing those documents. Those scholars wrote long books about democratic Cambodia. Some of them have been qualified as experts by this tribunal. And after all of that work, this is what they came up with: 25 confessions. Your Honours, if you would permit me, I would like to quote a sentence from the closing order. According to the closing order, the primary function of S21 was to extract confessions from detainees. That is at paragraph 455. Now, if the primary function of S21 was to extract confessions, wouldn't the direct supervisor of the chairman see those confessions on a regular basis? And after 3 decades of reviewing the evidence, wouldn't there be some substantial proof that he saw them? Yet, even if we accept as true every fact the prosecution claims to be true, we would conclude that Nuon Chea was sent just over half of 1% of the confessions in existence. The testimonial evidence before the chamber is equally clear that Nuon Chea received only a very small number of S21 confessions. As the co-prosecutors rightly observe, one witness who appeared before this chamber testified that he picked up envelopes from Dutch and delivered them to Nuon Chea. However, the co-prosecutors left out a rather important detail. They left out the fact that this witness, So Tương, testifies to delivering documents from Dutch to Nuon Chea a total of 5 times. Now, the co-prosecutors observed that according to Dutch, only 2 messengers were responsible for delivering confessions to Nuon Chea. He identified those 2 messengers by name. One of them was So Tương. The same So Tương who testified that only 5 times did he ever deliver any material from Dutch to Nuon Chea. Your Honours, this affirmatively proves that Nuon Chea received virtually no material from S21, and in our view, Your Honours, all of this raises an important question. The question is, why was this small selection of documents apparently sent to Nuon Chea? The prosecution says they were sent to Nuon Chea because they were from S21 and Nuon Chea was in charge of S21. But if that were true, many confessions would have been sent to Nuon Chea. President, Council, thank you. The time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a break now and we will resume at 3 p.m.
សូមក្រោកឈរ